Entonces, para empezar este coloquio con la conferencia inaugural de Pierre Purseigle, Geographies of Belligerence, Towards the Global History of the First World War. Pierre Purseigle es egresado del Instituto de Estudios Políticos de Lyon, en Francia, y doctor en Historia. Pierre Purseigle es Marie Curie Research Fellow en la Universidad de Yale and Associate Professor en la Universidad de Warwick. Es cofundador y presidente de la Sociedad Internacional de Estudios de la Gran Guerra y dirige la revista First World War Studies. Recientemente ha sido elegido Fellow de la Royal Historical Society. Enseñó historia contemporánea en las universidades de Toulouse, Oxford, Birmingham y en el Instituto de Estudios Políticos de París. Es autor del libro Mobilisation, Sacrifice et Citoyenneté, Angleterre-France 1900-1918, Paris les Belles Lettres, et coauteur de, paso del francés al español, no sé en qué idioma estoy hablando, de Le Monde Britannique 1815-1931, Paris-Berlin. Además, codirige con Adam Sepp, Texas, el Oxford Handbook of World War I, actualmente en prensa. Muchísimas gracias, Pierre. Entonces le dejo la palabra para esta conferencia inaugural.
Merci. Can you hear me? Yeah? Hi, can you all hear me? Is that okay? Yeah? Merci, Madame la Directrice, Madame l'Ambassadeur. I'm going to switch back to English. I'm afraid I'm one of those people who just linguistically challenged, so I'm afraid I won't be able to interact with you all in Spanish. Apologies in advance. Dear colleagues, dear friends, let me start by expressing my sincere thanks to the organizers of, and to the sponsors of this conference for the kind invitation to speak before you today. It is a real personal and indeed a real intellectual pleasure and an honor to be standing in front of you today. But I must confess to feeling some trepidation as I stand here today. Because I'm perhaps the last one you would expect to address and indeed open a conference on Latin America in the First World War. I am, as you know perhaps, primarily a historian of Western Europe, a comparative historian of what is commonly and misleadingly perhaps referred to as the epicenter of this world conflagration. For by and large, the Latin American experiences of the war remain largely neglected in the historiography of the First World War. And I have no doubt that the questions that I will raise during our sessions in the next 2 days will betray my personal ignorance of your respective fields of investigation. But I shall plead guilty of ignorance on behalf of most historians of the Great War who continue to confine Latin America to the margins of the historiography. Although I'm stepping out of my comfort zone and areas of expertise, the attention I've paid in the last couple of years to centers and periphery in the historiography of the conflict, to what I call the geographies of warfare and belligerence, stems from a series of personal and collective projects. And many of them actually originated in conversations I've had for many years with historians of Latin America and with Olivier Compagnon in particular. And these conversations and Olivier's publications, among others, prompted me to think more carefully, more systematically than I've had in the past about the ways in which one might write the history of the First World War, how we could interrogate it as a European, but also as a global conflict. That usually happens. All right. I can use the mouse too, yeah. Thank you. Oops. No, I don't want to install that. There you go. The study of the First World War has been a thriving field in the last 20, 30 years, thanks to a series of historiographical movements which have affected the profession as a whole. As a result, what distinguishes the field is first the importance, if not the absolute dominance, of cultural studies, cultural history. Second, it is the emergence and the exponential growth of comparative and transnational studies. Third, the pluridisciplinarity of the field that has benefited from the input of literary scholars, international relations specialists, sociologists, anthropologists, and so on. And such pluridisciplinarity testifies, I think, to the continuing contemporary cultural and political resonance of the war itself. And there is perhaps no better indicator of the health of the field than the number of publications and, most significantly, the originality and the quality of the work produced by graduate and postdoctoral scholars. And if I may plug the society that I'm involved in, I think the existence and activities of the International Society for First War Studies offer a very good illustration of that. But, there was always going to be a but, I cannot help but expressing a certain degree of frustration at the continuing dominance of national approaches to the war. For the growth in transnational studies of the war, must historians continue to pay lip service to the European and global history of the war, as they remain confined within well-established national and indeed disciplinary boundaries. For there also remains a detrimental gap between the military, social, and cultural histories of the war, as well as between disciplines and methodologies deployed within what we call First World War studies. There have, of course, been previous attempts to write this kind of global history of the conflict, but they tend to belong to two different genres. The first one was what I would call grand synthesis. I guess the best example of this is Hugh Strahan's magisterial first volume of his First World War, To Arms. Sir Hugh is one of very few scholars, of course, who were equipped to deal with the narrative and analytical challenges the global history of the war raises. The second type of attempt is collective in nature and can be found under the form of collective volumes or journal special issues. And they do, however, often by necessity, tend to rely on the juxtaposition of national or disciplinary case studies. One remarkable exception, of course, is the three-volume Cambridge History of the First World War, edited by J. Winter. Such pioneering works have made an important contribution to the global history of the war, but have certainly not offered the final word. And a question remains, in my opinion, to be answered in a systematic fashion. How can we integrate, in a common analytical framework, the diversity, the complexity of experiences that unfolded on a global scale? How useful, for instance, is it to think in terms of centers and peripheries? So I very much look forward to the comments and criticism that, informed by your Latin American perspectives, you will hopefully share with me throughout the conference. These questions, I believe, must be addressed within a wider reflection on the transformations. Oops. Still not working. All right. Work? Yay. Transformational warfare. And the reason why it's important to think about this in this way, I think, is because it has clear implications for both the chronology and the geography of the conflict. The First World War has, of course, long been seen as the quintessential industrial modern war, brought about at the culmination and concatenation of a series of economic, social, and political transformations that had taken place in Europe mainly since the late 18th century. Significantly, these transformations also altered and redefined understanding and experiences of space and time. A great deal of ink has been spilled to discuss, revise, and debate the idea of World War I as a rupture in European and world history. For long, historians argued to determine if the Great War was a total war and if it constituted a revolution in military affairs. Yet I wonder if, articulated in these terms, the reflection on the character of the war does not tend to draw attention away from the diversity of experiences and context that this conflict brought about. Here I owe, and I think we all owe, a great deal to colleagues who've written about the imperial dimensions of the war. The recent historiography of the war has, as a result, nuanced our vision of the war as a clean break with the past, since colonial warfare had already challenged the conventional demarcation between soldiers and civilians, combatants and non-combatants, and indeed a feature of military operations and occupation policies on the European battlefields. One must therefore consider the war in the wider context of the transformations of imperialism as a political project, but also in the context of the changes in the modes and policies of imperial domination, including, of course, the projection of violence into colonial domains. Evoking centers and peripheries in World War I is clearly just another way to stress that the war must be conceived within a larger political geography of imperial, and I would also argue domestic, domination. In the inaugural issue of First War Studies, Houston brilliantly deconstructed the labels and names successively applied to the war. Third Balkan War, the European War, the Great War, and finally the World War. These do not only reveal the geopolitics of the conflict, its imperial dimensions, or that it required the mobilization of the globalized economy. The invocation of a world war also revealed the ideological charge of the conflict construed in existential terms. The protagonist, Weltanschauung, therefore accounts for the determination to fight and win this Weltkrieg. In other words, a geography of warfare in the era of the Great War must be political, economic, and cultural. The historiography of the First World War still betrays the continuing dominance of national and European perspectives. The conventional chronology of the war, 1914-1918, is another heritage of conventional diplomatic and military history. Recent works have, however, stressed the necessity to place the First World War in a larger chronological framework, 1911-1923, in the continuum of colonial conflicts, European war, civil wars, revolutions, political violence, and genocide. Here I'm thinking of the important individual and collective interventions of John Hart and Robert Goddard. The war clearly did not end on the 11th of November 1918, as 4 million people died between 1918 and 1923. So seen from Latin America, the question I have for you is, what would a truly global chronology of the war be like? My objective here today is to pursue and further this reflection by developing a geographic perspective on the war. So my initial question is simple enough. What would a historical geography of the war, attentive to notions of space and place, would look like? To an extent, I've been encouraged and inspired by, like many other scholars, by Tim Snyder's Bloodlands. In a sense, locating the experience of the First World War, asking where the war took place, where it happened, prompt us to rethink what the war was and when it happened. Concerned with the transformations of warfare, this historical geography of the war would hopefully further our understanding of the totalizing and globalizing logic of the First War. Now, before going any further, let me clarify what I'm not arguing for. Ah, c'est avec l'autre. D'accord. Okay. Merci. What I'm not arguing for is a spatial turn in First War Studies. I'm happy to discuss this further if you wish, but basically the idea is that first, history and social sciences have always been concerned with space, even before the emergence of geography as a discipline. Second, stating the spatiality of war is merely stating the obvious. Soldiers fight with maps, battles transform landscapes and terrains, and wars create their own imaginative geographies. Having said this, spatial metaphors are so prevalent in historical and social scientific discourse that we ought to offer a few words of definition. John Lewis Gaddis, in his Landscape of History, rightly pointed out the important roles that metaphors play in history, art, and sciences. What I would suggest is that we need to clarify our categories of analysis or understanding of peripheries, for instance, to ensure that the deployment yield the highest heuristic benefit possible. Gender historians have demonstrated how useful spatial metaphors can be by exploring the construction and enforcement of the distinction between public and private or domestic spheres. Michel Foucault and his Heterotopia, has allowed us to rethink the body and the performance of sexual identities and practices in their spatial context. Queer studies scholars like Sarah Ahmed have convincingly demonstrated the need to take the spatiality of sexual orientation seriously. Yet, in multiplying spatial metaphors, we run the risk of diluting the heuristic value. As Michael Krang and Nigel Thrift put it, and I quote, "Space is the everywhere of modern thought. It is the flesh that flatters the bone of theory. It is an all-purpose nostrum to be applied whenever things look sticky." So there is a voluminous and sophisticated literature theorizing spatial perspectives in the social sciences and humanities. There does not appear to be, however, any real consensus within geography, urban studies, social and cultural theory, and history on the definition of space and place. Thus the need to clarify my own understanding of space and place, for they are the very concepts upon which any historical geography of the First World War must be funded. Place refers to location, to the natural and material environment in which historical actors go about their business. Place, in other words, is positional. Space is defined by movement, by the vectors of circulation of people, goods, and cultural representations. Space, in other words, is relational. It is, of course, very difficult to maintain a clear-cut distinction between place and place because historical experience constantly blurred the boundary between the two. One moves from one place to the other to interact, trade, fight with one another. There are processes invested with and ascribed meaning and cultural significance. Both place and space are culturally constructed. And Michel de Certeau, like others like Lucien Febvre and Fernand Braudel, for instance, is an essential guide. The key point here is that we should not lose sight of the materiality, or to put it another way, of the environmental nature of space and place. So what I would like to do here is to make a series of propositions that are not meant to offer a comprehensive rewriting of the experience of the First World War. More modestly, the objective here is to make a tentative but hopefully convincing case for a geographic approach to warfare and belligerence in the era of the Great War. The conventional geography of the war inherited from operational history reduces the war to belligerency and military operations. Shifting the emphasis to belligerence and the mobilization of resources in response to the war allows us to redefine both the spaces and temporalities of war. I intend to locate the conflict and trace its gradual penetration within and beyond the belligerent empires to include the experience of neutrals and colonial societies. If we are attentive to the varying intensity and spread of the conflict, to the global flows of manpower and material resources, as well as to the environmental and cultural impacts of the conflict, we have a way to rethink the experience of combat, of mobilization, of reconstruction, to rethink the notions of centers and peripheries, and to remap the Great War 100 years on. Let's start with military geography. And that defines the war in terms of military operations, of their location and their significance. And there is indeed a need for hierarchy, for a process of geographic differentiation that reflects one's own perspective, be it operational or strategic, for instance. Yet such a geography, illustrated here by a pretty recent atlas of the First World War, does not render the global nature of the war. In the Western world, and particularly in the English-speaking historiography of the war, the Western Front is at the very center of the discussion, which is not even Eurocentric. The Eastern European fronts have only recently attracted the attention they deserve from military and social historians. This vision of the war is summed up by the notion of sideshows, a subordinate front located at the periphery of the great power, also often treated as a costly diversion, away from the battle's center of gravity, as Clausewitz would put it. In Britain, the Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire was often discussed in those terms. And if you look at this map here, you'll notice that, and I cannot really read the map clearly, but if you look at Latin America, it's outside the war, which I think is clearly that we are likely to challenge during this conference. Now, this is not to say that the hierarchy of fronts revealed by this conventional geography of the war is entirely without credit. Though I'm keen to paraphrase Dipesh Chakrabarty, to provincialize, as he puts it, what remains largely depicted as a European war, one must accept that northwestern Europe was at the very strategic center of the war. The problem here is not only that the distinction between center and periphery is implicitly or explicitly normative, but that as a result, the rest of the world, and Latin America specifically, is deemed outside the war. The point here is that once we've accepted that the First World War revealed fundamental transformations of the business of war, that industrialized warfare required the all-out mobilization of human, material, and political resources, it is clear that the geography of the war cannot be defined by front lines alone. In other words, thinking about the geography of the war is yet another way to challenge conventional demarcations and boundaries between the military, economic, and social-cultural histories of the war. Another interesting way, in my opinion, to reflect upon centers and peripheries in the war is to consider the experience of neutral countries. What happens when we try to put neutrality on this historical map? Let me quote, neutrality as a status of international law may therefore be defined as a condition of the state which abstains from all participation in the war and maintains an attitude of impartiality in its dealing with the belligerents. The problem, as the American legal scholar Lawrence Peirce goes on to note, is that neutrality is no insurance against war. Peirce was here referring to direct violation of neutrality. The implications of modern warfare, however, meant that the conflict could force itself, as it were, upon the neutrals, even when neutrality had not been violated by military means. In this context, the political, economic, cultural, and in some cases military responses to the war articulated by neutral countries in Europe and in Latin America and around the globe begs the question of their capacity to preserve their freedom, their autonomy, their capacity to remain truly out of the war during the war. For neutrals did not only witness the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, they were also participants, whose experiences up until 5-10 years ago were all but ignored in the historiography. When discussed, the experience of neutrals, like that of Italy or the USA, was often considered in light of their subsequent entry into the war. What mattered was not so much neutrality than the road to belligerency. And here's a critical distinction, I think, that we need to make. So this is a map of belligerents and neutrals in 1917. Familiar to most of you, I suspect. So a critical distinction that I think we could perhaps do is a distinction between belligerency and belligerence. Belligerency is a status, that of states at war, defined in international law. Belligerence, by contrast, is a process defined by the disposition toward, organization for the prosecution of the war. Belligerence refers to the contested process of adaptation to the demands of industrial warfare, a process that was particularly relevant for neutral countries. As a result, the map of the belligerent world looks significantly different and should include peripheral and marginal regions, but also areas which had long been deemed to be outside the war in Scandinavia or Latin America, for instance. The key for us here is to find a way to integrate such liminal experiences in the broader historiographical framework. A military geography will combine two maps, that of belligerencies, countries at war with regard to international law, and that of belligerents. In suggesting the need to move to a geography of belligerence, I want to ensconce the question of the character of the war at the core of our reflections. It is also a way to reconsider the chronology of the war. As I said earlier, the chronology of the war remained largely defined by diplomatic and military events. Indeed, the mobilization of armed forces is often confused with the declaration of war itself. So in France, for instance, the mobilization of armed forces happened on the 1st of August, which assumed to be the official start of the war, but in fact France is officially at war with Germany on the 3rd of August. Let me move away from Western Europe and take us straight to Central Asia to illustrate what I think is an important point. the geography and chronology of the war should be defined in terms of the mobilization of resources and manpower. Central Asian populations did not enter into the war when the Russian Empire did on the 1st of August 1914. It did so in response to the intensification and totalization of the war in the second half of the conflict. On the 25th of June 1916, the imperial authorities revoked existing exemptions and called up Central Asian men, mainly Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Uzbeks, to serve in labor battalions. This prompted an anti-colonial revolt that contributed to the growing imperial crisis faced by Russia. It was the moment when, according to George Sanborn, a crisis turned into a fully blown revolutionary situation. For these populations, the war truly began not when Russia declared a belligerency in August 1914, but 2 years later, when the war and mobilization intensified to such an extent that it penetrated regions which had until then been large in spirit. As we accept, with Robert Goddard and others, the need to look at what they call the Greater War, we may also need to entertain the fact that the war may, in a sense, also look smaller than previously thought. We therefore need to adapt our methods to this geography of experiences that were not confined materially or culturally to one spatial unit, be that of the nation-state, the local community, or the empire. The history of African campaigns, for instance, demonstrate that the combination and integration of different scales of analysis, local and imperial, is essential to place these campaigns in the context of imperialism, of the Great War, but also in the social history of the communities directly affected by the mobilization and military operations. Although most of us would argue, I hope, that we need to move away from exclusively national perspectives, I do not intend to reject national history. Quite the contrary. In combining different scales of analysis to approach different territories of mobilization, including peripheries, the idea here is to enrich and supplement the history of the nation-state. This is what I attempted to do in my comparative urban history of the war by going both beyond and below the nation to think through the nation, to appropriate Antoinette Burton's phrase. In this way, the geography of belligerence that I'm calling for is also a way to rethink the belligerent state. Now, many of you will undoubtedly be familiar with James Scott's anthropology of the state, but I'm not here primarily concerned with the visualization and the construction of space through mapping and cadastral surveys, but I'm rather interested in the location of state activities. The idea here is to ask where the state was as a way to revise our understanding of what the wartime state was. I've offered in a first iteration of my argument in a recent article, and there's certainly no time for me to present it in full. Let me just say that in adopting a pragmatic and functional approach to the state and to its relationship with civil society in the First World War, we do obtain a very different picture than that of the centralized, industrialized Leviathan, imposing its will upon subordinate and peripheral actors. That's okay, sorry, I'm confusing myself, which happens quite a lot. This geography of warfare and belligerence would also, I think, allow us to take a different look at the aftermath of the First World War, at the reconstructions that followed. One of the most enduring images of the First World War, one that still permeates the historiography, is that of this tragic stalemate embodied by millions of soldiers stuck in the mud of the Western Front. This image belies the fact that the belligerent space is defined by mobility to and from the combat zones, as much as it is by the apparent static line of trenches. Likewise, the aftermath of the conflict is defined by the continuing displacement of populations and by the attempt of refugees to resettle and to relocate. The challenge here, of course, was material and economic, but it was also social and cultural and required the populations to rebuild a place and to rebuild a sense of place. Across the old empires, this also required the reorientation of infrastructures away from the old imperial capital cities. Here again, we're looking at a process which was intensely local and transnational and required the mobilization of material, political, and cultural resources at the level of urban and rural communities, of the nation state, and of the empires and across allied nations. The war and the ensuing civil wars and revolutions redrew the political maps of Europe and of the world. Recent work on Fiume by Dominic Riel at the University of Miami shows the need again to integrate different scales of analysis. Fiume is unfortunately best known for the antics of Gabriele D'Annunzio, more known for that than it is for its fascinating post-war experiment in reshaping sovereignty. For urban populations in Fiume, attempted to define sovereignty outside the framework of the nation-state and international law. The transition from war to peace in this very particular context is also a transition, or rather a very pragmatic attempt, to carve out a political and legal niche between the Habsburg imperial polity and the nationalizing project of the Italian state. The impact of the war on imperial political geographies is obviously well known, but Mary Lewis's work on legal pluralism in Tunisia in the interwar years is a brilliant illustration of the need and of the value of the combination of scales of analysis: international, imperial, national, and local. Finally, the reconfiguration of the international order forced neutral countries to redefine the national identities, for neutrality is relational and defined by interaction with other powers. The debate in Sweden, for example, is particularly heated in interwar years, as Liza Sturfeld has shown. But the Americas, of course, also offer striking illustrations of these processes. As we've seen, the distinction between centers and peripheries is a normative distinction that remains steeped and indissociable from the politics and history of imperialism. Imperial societies, including those empires that survived the war, confronted not only the political and economic aftershocks of the conflict, but also the need to redefine their place in the imperial world. The work of Priya Satya and the British campaign in the Middle East perfectly illustrate what I would call the cultural reinvestment in imperial geography. Priya shows that the experience of British troops in a campaign that was considered a sideshow during the war continued to play the central role during and in the aftermath of the war. The campaign in Palestine and Mesopotamia resurrected both conventional vision of martial heroism and a faith in technology and therefore civilization that had been shattered by the war in Europe and appeared to have sunk in the mud of France and Flanders. Air power was thus not simply deployed as a tool of imperial policy and coercion, but also allowed the British to renew their civilizing, modernizing project. In a context marked by doubt and fears of national decline, the Middle Eastern campaigns enabled them to rejuvenate their commitment to the imperial project. In conclusion, my objective here was to make a few pragmatic propositions intended to spur and prompt a collective, collegial conversation about the best way to move the field forward. As Hugh Strachan demonstrates in his contribution to the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of World War I, the transformations of strategy were fundamentally a transformation of the spatial understanding of the war. His analysis stands in sharp contrast to the views of many senior commanders, namely that the principle of war-making had not been affected by the conflict. For them, what was valid on the battlefield applied to the theater. What worked for a single campaign could determine the strategic conduct of an entire war. Such a restricted definition of strategy focuses on operational level and on land warfare. But the necessity of economic mobilization, the capacity and willingness of belligerents to project power across the oceans, and eventually across airspace, effectively expanded the battlefield. Interwar theorists of air power would insist on the inclusion of the non-combatant world into the battlefield. Strategy, and then grand strategy, defined itself less as the use of the battle for the purposes of war, and more as the use of war for the purposes of policy. The interwar years also witnessed the emergence of geopolitics as a field of study and policy making. The elaboration of war aims, both within and outside Europe during the war, centered around the exploitation of space. Colonization was to define the wartime and post-war relationship to space, to its resources and inhabitants. National socialist thinkers and the Nazi regime, of course, would turn these ideas into policies. So I'd like to conclude by raising two questions. The first one is, unsurprisingly, that of the relationship between the war and globalization, a question that is central to but does not exhaust the global history of the war. Both the economic and environmental history of the war underlines the critical importance of the flows of resources and energy, but there's still a lot to do on the local, national, and global logistics of the war. Michael B. Miller, in his Europe and the Maritime World in the 20th Century, rightly insists on the critical importance of the maritime war and on global shipping logistics. He also argues, quite convincingly, I think, that despite the disruption to trade and migration, the war might not have brought a deglobalization, that globalization continued, but in different ways, albeit at a different pace. The First War reconfigured the flows of resources. In the case of empire, the nature of the relationship is transformed, even temporarily. The extraction of resources was not simply a projection of force or strength, the manifestation of colonial domination, but rather the recognition, the acknowledgement of the center's dependence on the peripheries. And this leads, once again, to the necessity to combine scales of analysis to ensure that our research fit with the spaces of experience that the belligerent populations lived in and through. It may perhaps be time to move beyond centers and peripheries to explore what Antoinette Burton called the structural below and the geographic below, to challenge Eurocentric approaches to the war, of course, but most importantly, to unearth what the conventional categories of analysis inherited from political, diplomatic, and operational history, nation-state, belligerency, and so on, have obscured for so long. This, 100 years after the outbreak of the war, I think should mobilize our scholarly community. As we commemorate the outbreak of the war, the question for me and many other colleagues is the following. What impact could the centenary have on the historiography of the war, on the way we write its history, on the way we could approach the experience of the modern industrial war waged on a global scale? This question also betrays, it has to be said, a certain degree of frustration with the quality of the public and indeed intellectual debate over the war. Despite the tremendous level of publishing activity, very little has been printed or said that had not only already been printed or said before. And I think our conference shows that there is, however, still a lot to be said and written about this war. And I'm indeed confident that historians of Latin America can and will take the lead in reshaping our field in the years to come. Thank you for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias, Pierre, por su conferencia inaugural, por esta visión procesual, ¿no? Y que nos permite entender como la reconstrucción, pero también la nueva cartografía y la nueva definición de los lugares en la economía global después de este evento muy importante que fue la Primera Guerra Mundial. Tenemos, porque son muy razonables, antes de un receso al cual los vamos a invitar todos, lugar para una o dos preguntas y respuesta, pero sería bien si sean preguntas más que comentarios para poder dar de nuevo la palabra a Pierre. Muchas gracias.
I'm just going to need a helmet. Not quite a helmet.
Quizás no haya, pero quizás hay una...